Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host. And before we begin our lecture proper for today, I just like to do a customary recap and touch base on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lectures, we discussed World War One. We discussed that early on in the United States there was a very major political motivation for remaining neutral, and that was mainly to keep the ethnic voting blocks in line. Nobody wanted to alienate potential voters by declaring for one alliance over the other. This was more prominent with the Democratic Party. Irish Catholics made up a very large percentage of their urban-based voters, and they did not want to support the British and alienate them. There were Germans to consider as well. Nobody wanted to alienate the Germans or the Hungarians or the Austrians who immigrants or descendants of immigrants who made up considerable portions of their voting blocks. So it's a very sort of like touchy subject for those groups. We also looked at the Zimmerman Telegraph. The Zimmerman Telegraph really sort of galvanized populations and centers that largely felt that they didn't have any motivation, any sort of rationale for joining or supporting the war effort. Most of the support from the war came from along the Atlantic seaboard, people along the Pacific coast, in the Great Plains, the Southwest, and so forth. The core heartland of the old Louisiana Purchase country. They didn't really feel that they should have participated in or should be drawn into a European affair. They didn't see why they had to send their sons or see their tax dollars go towards fighting a European war. The Zimmerman Telegraph was a supposed plot by Imperial Germany to conspire with the Mexican Republic to help Mexico reacquire not just Texas, but all of the lands given up in the Mexican cession. So basically, it sort of galvanized, sort of turned heads as Americans living in California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, portions of Oklahoma, Texas. They all became galvanized and became supporters of this war effort. And there were other people in places such as Oregon, Montana, Missouri, and so forth. They all sort of saw the Zimmerman Telegraph had a violation of American sovereign rights. So they became supporters of the war. And most importantly, we looked at Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson himself won re-election in 1916 by campaigning that he had kept the Republic out of war. But no sooner had he won re-election did he embark on a campaign to fight the war tooth and nail. And Wilson was kind of quixotic in his approach to the war. He clearly favored Great Britain. Depending on how you look at him, on how you look at the situation, he's either a third or a second generation immigrant. His mother was an immigrant from England, and his paternal grandparents immigrated from Ireland, from Northern Ireland. And he clearly had very strong ties, very, very close opinions regarding the superiority of the British political system. And as president, he did all he could to support the British war effort while wearing a veneer of American neutrality. But Wilson himself was really disillusioned by the war, by his peace treaty experience. He had expected the British and the French to more openly see his point of view. He had not expected them to be so vindictive, so cruel, so short-sighted. And he was equally met with disappointment when he returned to the United States, and he presented his treaty to the Senate for ratification. The Senate refused to ratify it. The United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles, and Wilson attempted to curtail that. He attempted to sidestep that, but he suffered a stroke, and that ended not only his political career, but also any hopes of his League of Nations becoming into effect. Coming into effect with the strength and the backing of the United States to really give it some to really give some teeth to its bite. All right, and with that being said, let's dive right into our topic for today. And today we are going to discuss African Americans in the early 20th century. Now, as discussed in previous lectures, in the decades following the end of Reconstruction, African American civil rights were rolled back across the Republic. The presence of African Americans in local, state, federal affairs gradually eroded as the Redeemer methods of disenfranchisement gained traction through the use of literacy tests, poll and property taxes, grandfather clauses, white-only primaries. These were all aided by laws that formally established Jim Crow segregation and extended Jim Crow into the daily life of all Americans, establishing separation on public streetcars, rail cars, and other forms of public transportation, while other laws banned African Americans from restaurants and hotels completely. In some cases, the law permitted African Americans to use back doors for theaters. Other permitted African Americans to use public facilities like swimming pools on separate days. Now, as we have already discussed in previous lectures, the Supreme Court proved pivotal in shaping the social climate of the Republic, beginning with the civil rights cases of 1883 and continuing with the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case. The Supreme Court eroded the legal and constitutional protections afforded to African Americans by the 14th Amendment. With the Plessy case, the legal doctrine of separate but equal was established. In practice, these facilities were never equal. The social climate and atmosphere of the time is really best summed up by Associate Justice Henry Brown, who wrote, "Legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions." Now, the Plessy case was simultaneously a surrender and a confirmation of the prejudicial atmosphere of the Republic at the turn of the 20th century. The thinking, in part, was based on social Darwinism, and social Darwinism is a modification of the English naturalist Charles Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest. Social Darwinism argued that certain races were inherently superior or inferior to others. In the United States, African Americans were at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. This theory was widely accepted in the United States at the dawn of the 20th century, but few people of the time accepted social Darwinism theory of racial inferiority more than Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was among one of the most racist men to occupy the White House. He was one of the more racist men to be active in American policy at any time. Wilson was among Wilson's administration was among one of the most destructive for African Americans. Between 1913 and 1921, segregation was implemented in all federal facilities. It was introduced in departments where it had never existed at all. During Wilson's administration, African Americans were restricted to the most menial jobs within the federal government. At the same time, violence against African Americans was becoming more widespread, approaching the same rate and violence that was epidemic, that had become an epidemic during the Redemption campaign by former Confederates and Confederate sympathizers in the former slave states. Now, the most violent of these actions was lynching, and lynching could be administered for trivial things such as looking at a white person in the face or being judged to be too successful. These were under the Jim Crow unwritten aspects of the Jim Crow segregation law. These were all capital offenses for African Americans, male or female. During the late 1890s, more than 1,000 African American young men were burned to death or hung in festive environments. When not confronted with lynch mob violence, African Americans were assaulted on a daily basis with economic poverty. In many instances, African Americans were regulated to less than 3% of all industrial jobs and represented 10% of all skilled laborers employed. Now, while the Plessy case dictated the separation of both races, the equality was far from the reality in every bar, education being chief among them. Illiteracy among African Americans in the 20th century in the slave states stood at nearly 80%, which is in marked contrast to the literacy and illiteracy levels of European Americans in the old slave states, which stood at below 20%. Now, legal slavery had been abolished, but a new form of slavery rose to take its place: debt peonage. African American sharecroppers, and really sharecroppers in general, were forced to take out loans fronted to them by their landlords that they would have to pay off with their yearly crops. This really just locked them. The majority of African Americans, it just locked them into the old plantation unskilled field laborers. Sort of trapped. They were sort of trapped in a position where they could not break out of it, where they were sort of doomed to simply live out their lives as unskilled laborers, living much the same as slaves had done in the 1830s, 1840s. Now, as discussed earlier, Booker T. Washington was one of the most recognized African American leaders of his time. In this environment of extreme discrimination and widespread segregation, Washington rose to be one of the most influential African American leaders since Frederick Douglass. His career began in earnest at 16 when he left home to attend Hampton Institute in Virginia. Hampton was one of the few educational facilities created to educate African Americans during Reconstruction, and Washington was to prove decisive. To Washington, it was to prove decisive in his future. Hampton Institute at the time was administered by a former Union Army commander, Samuel Armstrong, and Armstrong was to prove to be, in turn, a major influence on Washington. And he actually helped Washington find benefactors to cover his finances during his stay at Hampton Institute. And in 1881, when the state of Alabama reached out to Armstrong for help finding a new principal for their new school to be opened up for African Americans in Tuskegee, Hampton recommended Washington. Now, the state of Alabama had hoped for a white principal. However, Armstrong persisted and insisted that they hire Washington. Now, Alabama agreed to apportion $2,000 for teacher salaries, but they did not provide any funds for land or for buildings. Now, Washington, when he took over Tuskegee Institute, he placed an emphasis on manual skills. That is, boys learning practical skills such as shoemaking and carpentry, and girls learning and cooking, sewing. Cooking and sewing. Washington also put the students to work, raising funds and helping construct the school buildings. And within a decade, Tuskegee had 500 students in its agricultural sciences and manual arts programs. Now, while the Tuskegee Institute did not raise Washington's reputation, he nonetheless rose to prominence, and he rose to prominence in 1895. Some say, some count 1895 as his rise to prominence. Others see it as his rise to infamy. But nonetheless, in 1895, he gave a memorable speech at the Cotton States International Exposition. And in this speech that we referenced before, Washington was quoted as advising his fellow African Americans to cast their buckets down where they were. And by this, he meant that they should stay in the agricultural sector. This speech has often come to be regarded as Washington's acceptance of the status quo. Now, while Washington did not discriminate, he did not accept discrimination or the intolerance inflicted upon African Americans. He did believe that the best way to fight Jim Crow was by raising the educational levels of all African Americans. Washington did not believe in protesting or demanding civil rights. To many African Americans, this speech, along with Washington's autobiography entitled "Up from Slavery," was an accommodation to the status quo. It was his blind assent. His blind assent to the realities, to the present predicament of African Americans. They even at this point began to look at Washington and what he was doing at Tuskegee, and a number of his critics were university-educated African Americans, and they were devising more confrontational approaches that veered greatly from what he did at Tuskegee to combat Jim Crow. Now, this movement to establish an identity, and really this is what they were trying to do. They were trying to establish an identity for the African American community. It was really initiated during Reconstruction, and it was really spurred on by the abolishment of slavery, which allowed African Americans to, for the first time, for the first time for many African Americans, to claim their inventions as their own. As noted previously, during slavery, the slave was the property of the master, and any invention of the slaves could be claimed by their masters. African Americans now had the right to patent their works and receive compensation for their ideas. Between 1870 and 1890, more than 300 patents were awarded to African Americans. And they include patents for folding beds, letterboxes, lawnmowers, and of course the electric lamp. These products have had a lasting impact on the lives of Americans and American industries and culture. And with that being said, and particularly with this look at patents, I'd like to look at George Washington Carver. Now, George Washington Carver was a former slave who became internationally renowned as an agricultural scientist. Carver was also the most well-known instructor at Tuskegee Institute. Through his career, he encouraged farmers across the Southeast to shift their reliance from cotton, which drastically reduced the soil productivity. He urged the farmers to plant nutrient-enriching crops like peanuts and sweet potatoes. Carver also created hundreds of commercial uses for soil-renewing crops to spur interest in their cultivation. Now, through his career, Carver experimented with improvements, becoming widely celebrated at home and abroad. Elijah McCoy was another person who had a great career working as an inventor. Elijah McCoy is most renowned for his lubrication for devising inventions for lubricating moving machinery. His most lasting invention was the drip cup, which enabled heavy-duty machinery such as steam engines for trains and transoceanic liners to self-lubricate while still in operation. Jan Metlinger was a Surinese immigrant to the United States, and he found work early on in a shoe factory. He would later go on to design a machine with the ability to cut, sew, and track shoes while attaching the upper shoe to the sole, as well as any human could. And this machine was able to create a finished product in roughly 1 minute. The success of his machine caused a 50% drop in the price of shoes in the United States. And Messlinger later sold his patent to the United Shoe Manufacturing Company in the early 1880s. And it was not long before these machines just like the one he designed, were installed in shoe factories around the world. Garrett Morgan was another person adding to this new identity for African Americans. He invented the gas inhalator or gas mask. And he successfully used his invention to rescue men trapped in a tunnel explosion, after which Morgan received hundreds of orders for his gas inhalator. Now, although gas masks were used during World War I, Morgan did not enjoy great success. Many Southerners, many pro-Jim Crow segregationists canceled their orders when they discovered that he was a black man, when they discovered he was an African American. Morgan is also remembered as the inventor of the modern traffic light, which he sold to General Electric for $40,000. And this explosion of inventors and great inventions continued. Granville Woods patented several inventions that spurred technological advances. Among his inventions were the electromechanical brake, a telegraphy system that involved sending messages from moving trains. Woods also developed a telephone system that he sold to American Bell Telephone Company back in 1887. Elizabeth Terrell, she wasn't an inventor, but she was a very noted early civil rights activist who disagreed with Washington. She was one of the many critics of Booker T. Washington, an admirer, but also a critic. Ida Wells Barnett was another remarkable woman and civil rights leader for her time. They both were remarkable women and leaders for their time and era. They both were born during the Civil War. Both were educated at the colleges established during Reconstruction, and both were dedicated to contesting social Darwinism, racism, and sexism. Mary Terrell. She was born in Ohio. She was educated in Ohio at Wilberforce College, but she herself was from Memphis, Tennessee. She began her career with the Colored Women's League, rising to leadership positions as the organizations merged with other women's clubs en route to forming the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. Terrell was a firm advocate of what W.E.B. Du Bois would call ceaseless agitation. Nonetheless, she remained a firm supporter of Washington. She was critical of him, but she also saw the beauty in what he was doing at Tuskegee. Now, praising his leadership, she gravitated more towards the social stance of Du Bois, however, and she herself will become a founding member of the NAACP. Ida Wells Barnett, born in Mississippi, and worked her way through Fisk University in Tennessee. Ida Wells Barnett in 1884 filed a suit against a Tennessee railway after she was thrown out of a all-white car, and she won. Wells Barnett would later make headlines in 1891 when she was fired by the Memphis School Board for criticizing their funding of the city's African-American schools. Wells Barnett would later moved into journalism, making a name for herself through her scathing reviews, where she wrote detailing the horrors of lynching in African-American newspapers in Chicago and New York. As a matter of fact, in 1895, Wells Barnett published the Red Record, a researched analysis of lynching in the southeast of the United States, and today it remains one of the best sourced and best primary documents of really the length and the scope of lynching and the acceptability of lynching in the early republic. Now, the most influential of these leaders during this period, as African Americans were trying to establish something for themselves in the face of contesting Jim Crow, was W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois was the most influential African American figure of his age. Now, as mentioned before, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk, a seminal examination of the state of African American affairs. He also used The Souls of Black Folks to criticize Washington and all that he was doing. And he directly stated his opposition to the philosophy of accommodation. In 1905, Du Bois joined forces with William Monroe Trotter, the editor of the Boston Guardian, who was the most radical African-American public newspaper publishers. And really, the Boston Guardian was one of the most radical publications of all time, as far as advocating for racial equality and civil rights. Together, they founded the Niagara Movement. Now, Du Bois, like Washington, faced controversy during the course of his career. Many of the other civil rights leaders came to view him as an elitist for his promotion of the talented 10th. Now, to Du Bois, the talented 10th was simply the elite 10% of the African American community who should be given artistic and political and social influence over the other 90%. He believed that this small 10% should be the ones to represent the African American community at home and abroad. And Du Bois, that wasn't the only bit of controversy that he attracted. Du Bois held a favorable view of communism and the Soviet Union at a time when it was just dangerous to do so. Du Bois came to regard the Soviet Union as a land free of racial prejudice and class distinction. In his later years, as the Cold War began, Du Bois found his negative attitudes regarding American imperialism and international communism drew the ire of the United States government, and he would later migrate to Ghana, where he would spend the final days of his life having given up on achieving racial equality in the United States. Now, in the Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois identified race relations as the issue that would confront the United States in the 20th century. Now, while the first major storm to be weathered in the 20th century was World War I, which then was simply known as the Great War, among the various causes of World War I was European imperialism and the scramble for Africa during the late 1880s, in which multiple European powers hastily laid claim to and then began to subject the native peoples of Africa. Now, the competition between these European powers led to an increase in diplomatic tensions that simmered and teetered and tottered on the verge of eruption in a consuming Europe in a pan-European war. Now, during the military buildup before the United States' formal entry into World War I, African American leaders were encouraged to enlist, and leaders encouraged African Americans to enlist and to serve. Many, including Du Bois, pushed Americans. Many pushed young African Americans into service. Du Bois was, of course, one of the more notable ones of that. But there was still resistance to African American service members. A number of districtrats believed that African Americans being allowed to serve in the military would simply destroy them. It would simply introduce ideas into their heads about the way things should be in the former slave states. But in the end, more than 350,000 African American men served in the war. Nearly all of them served in the Army due to restrictions with naval service. You really can't enforce segregation that well on a naval vessel because of the close quarters. It's not like in an Army camp where you can have one section over there for one group and one section over here for another group. You really don't have that type of flexibility, that type of leeway on a ship vessel. You really can't like designate who can go into one area and who can't go into one area as far as crew members. You need all hands on deck, so to speak, on a ship, and you really can't do it that well when you're practicing segregation. You really can't implement it that well. Now, African American soldiers were restricted from leadership positions in the Army, and only 639 served as officers. Most of the African American soldiers were relegated to guarding supply lines and serving behind the lines of the 369th U.S. Infantry. And that unit will go on to be the most decorated, one of the most decorated units to see service during World War I. In an ironic twist, not iconic, ironic, the racial prejudice of John Pershing, the commander of the Expeditionary Force, sent the 369 to aid the French, who were suffering huge losses in the war and were nearing collapse. The 369th would become the most battle-hardened unit of the war, earning an unprecedented 171 Croix de Guerre medals from the French Republic. Now, despite their military service, there was no equal treatment for African Americans and no improvement to race relations awaiting them when they returned to the United States. And with that, we'll break and we'll pick back up during part 2 of our lectures on African Americans during the early 20th century. And as always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you thought about this lecture.